Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Teaching English webinar for teacher educators. Let me introduce you to our presenter today. Norman Vaughan is a professor in the Department of Education at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Canada. He has co-authored the books Principles of Blended Learning, Shared Metacognition, and Communities of Inquiry, Teaching in Blended Learning Environments, Creating and Sustaining Communities of Inquiry, and Blended Learning in Higher Education. In addition, he has published a series of articles on blended learning and teacher development. Dr. Vaughan is the co-founder of the Blended Learning Design Network, is a founding member of the Community of Inquiry Research Group, the associate editor of the International Journal of Mobile and Blended Learning, and he is on the editorial boards of numerous national and international journals. So we are very excited about today's session. So I'd like to introduce Norman to launch today's session.
Siren, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and I'm so excited to work with you. This is an area that's near and dear to my heart, not just the Community of Inquiry framework, but the work that all of you are doing all around the world. So hopefully, again, as Siren mentioned, please, any questions, put them in the Q&A. We may not have time in 1 hour to answer them, but I'll be sure to work with Siren that we follow up so that not only do you get the recording, but that you'll get responses to my question. This is, again, an area that I'm quite passionate in. So here we go. We'll get the slideshow going. So just to begin, whoops, we're going a little too quickly. Just to begin, I think what's always important for me is this sense of engagement. We talk a lot about it, but I think, again, just in my mind, I'll always be 19 or 20. But the context of our learners, the context of people that you're training continues to change. And I think it's important that we hear their voice and we hear what they think about engagement. Of course, the focus is going to be on the Community of Inquiry, and I want to give a little bit of a background about that. Talk about that, how that'll impact your roles to be effective in the work you're doing, and then how we can actually put these 7 principles related to the Community of Inquiry into practice so that you've got some really tangibles to take away from today. So the first thing I'd like to do is learner engagement. And again, I see that people are starting to put where they're from in the Q&A. Would you also just take a moment, just as I sort of explain, when you hear this word engagement, what does it mean to you? The institution I'm at is relatively old for where I'm from. We're over 100 years, but I know for a lot of you, this would be a young institution. But ever since the inception of our institution, we've talked about engaged learners. It was one of our first founders talked about, enabling, lighting the flame. So just as you're doing it in the Q of A, engagement, what does that mean to you? And I really encourage you, when you're starting a new module or a new training program with your educators, to just get people to have a conversation about engagement. What does it mean to you? What was engaged, the strategies, and coming up with a guideline. What does it mean to engaged? And this is what it's going to be, what we're going to do to be engaged and respect each other and learn from each other in our module. So just when we look at some of the work around this, this is a fellow that's really special with me. And again, we'll make sure we share these slides with you, is Dennis Littke has done a lot of work in the United States. When Barack Obama was the president, he was on the National Educational Advising Committee for both terms. And what I like about Dennis, he keeps things simple. He talks about the importance of relevance, relationships, and rigor. And when I work with my pre-service and my graduate students, they talk about relevance being about connected, that people can see how the learning's connected to their everyday life. And it's curious, it's questions they have about learning. In terms of relationships, I think this is really important. The work that we do is creating these communities, is that there is a sense of community. There's a sense of collaboration. The other thing Dennis emphasizes is that, we rise to a challenge. There needs to be that sense of rigor. And through the challenge, we're often led to quite a bit of creativity. on that note, and unfortunately, Mihai passed away for a couple of years ago, but this is an individual, especially during the 70s. He's a Hungarian psychologist, lived most of his life in the United States, though. And he's the one who coined the term in English, being in the zone, that people are present. They really are present with their learning. They're fully immersed in what they're doing. We've applied this often to athletes about being in the zone during the sport activity, but it's so exciting for me when I work with my students and my graduate students is that they don't want to leave a webinar, they don't want to leave, or maybe afterwards I'm at a coffee shop and I hear them taking up discussions, taking up things that we talked about in the webinar. Of course, this leads to this idea of learning to learn, metacognition, that people not only are aware of how they learn, but they start to develop strategies to help them empower and help them really with their learning. This is a work that I've been able to do with Randy Garrison, and we'll talk about a book that's freely open access. But I think it's so exciting, especially when we think of grad work with the oral exams, but we don't learn in isolation. We learn in context with each other, and how important it is that we're able, in a real meaningful way, to help people move further with the learning. There was a Russian educational philosopher, Lev Vygotsky, who talked about scaffolding and the zone of proximal development. And again, how a mentee and a mentor are also learning. They're also moving forward in their learning process. Just a couple more. When we look at indigenous ways of knowing all around the world, this is in Eastern North America, where I'm from. Two-eyed seeing, being able to see two sides of the coin, two sides of the story, being able to weave sort of the traditional indigenous ways with sort of the European, the American ways of knowing as well. So again, let's go from a strength-based approach, not throw one with the other, but how can we move forward in a good way with both those? So that's that one. Now let's go to the community of inquiry. And it's interesting where I come. I was just before talking with Siren and others. It's really interesting how different cultures, different countries, different nationalities have different approaches to learning. And in my mind, this should be, pretty obvious. Inquiry, this idea of learning through questioning. But where I come from, it's met with a lot of skepticism. I come from a province or a state where there really is a focus on individual learning. We do a lot of standardized testing. Our educational system in the primary and secondary is into four divisions. Division 1 would be kindergarten to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, and then 10 to 12. And we have standardized testing at each of them. And there really is a focus on standard learning and a lot of memorization. And often people, they talk about fuzzy inquiry-based learning. So what we did at an institution that I worked at for a number of years with Randy Garrison, the University of Calgary, is we got an undergraduate and a few graduate students to talk to anybody they could. What does inquiry mean to you? And again, we saw there were some disciplinary differences in terms of the social sciences versus medicine versus maybe the natural sciences, but it boiled down to these 5 areas that it really was about solving important questions. Again, with the shared metacognition, it didn't happen in isolation. There was a group feature. We were learning from each other. I'll be honest, this is something that sometimes is a little difficult for Canadians, that it involved critical discourse, agreeing to disagree. We weren't being pathological polite, and this is often an issue that can happen in an online discussion. Again, we do not want to make the discussion personal. We don't want to hurt people's feelings, but we need to, this is more than opinion based. Where's your information coming from? Where's the facts? Where's the science? Again, this is really important that it's multidisciplinary. It doesn't just happen. I know that Siren's doing some doctorate research. It's mixed methods. So she's using some qualitative and quantitative methods. And again, this isn't fuzzy. In all our disciplines, there is a research process that we follow. Moving on then is, again, this was the space race. This is sort of in my younger years of life. The Americans were very frustrated that the Russians were able to put the first person in space and orbit around the world. And it was under John F. Kennedy, the race to space. And this is when they really went crazy with standardized testing. But there's a really interesting institution. It's the University of Chicago. And Joe Schwab, one of the faculty members, said, "Hey, wait, time out, time out. Learning really is more than just learning a bunch of facts and isolated skills. It's learning how to think." So that was Schwab in 60. And then this is another faculty member of the University of Chicago, and we're going back quite a bit in time. And our fairly well-known educational philosopher in the States is John Dewey. And he did most of his writing during the First World War. We'll see one of his books in a minute, and during the Depression. And, the idea that technology is more than a tool. It's helping people develop mental frameworks for thinking. And then just want to point out, this is the definition from the Association from Education, Communication, Technology, that technology is more than tools. It's an ethical practice of learning. So just a few more, and then we'll get to the meat of it. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of the historical context. So this really was John's seminal book. It was Democracy in Education. And the strength of a democracy is really based on its public education. When we start segmenting and we start privileging one group of people over another with education, we lose that sense of democracy. And it really is, this quote just gets me, because it was 1916, so it's well over 100 years. But again, if we teach today's students as we taught yesterday, we rob them of tomorrow. And I don't want to get over on this, but I know that Siren and others are doing work with artificial intelligence. I think there's some real exciting potential, especially with English language learning. Okay, getting close now. So just Matt Lipman, a wonderful fella, an early childhood educator, did a lot of his work in the state of New York. But what he did, he studied how children learned, and he found that they don't learn in isolation. And again, when we think of kindergarten, they talk everything you needed to know in life you learned in kindergarten. And the big focus on kindergarten is learning that there are other people in the world and that we can help those people. We can teach them, but they can also teach us. The idea of to teach is to learn twice. Now, finally, we get to this Venn diagram. I remember the first time I saw this diagram, just all cards on the table. Randy Garrison was my doctoral advisor. I was teaching a number of grad courses. I didn't really know anything about it. I invited him in. And I'll be honest, the first time I saw this, it was overwhelming. So I'm going to try and break it down for you and do it in a way that we've got some concrete steps. So the way this was created is that there was 3 wonderful individuals working at one of our larger universities in Canada. It's the University of Alberta, which is in the capital of my province, Edmonton. So we had Randy Garrison, who'd done a lot of work in adult education, a lot of work with cognitive thinking. So he already had this practical inquiry model. He was really focused on this idea of cognitive presence. We had Walter Archer, who was a really interesting fellow, associate dean of the engineering faculty, but he was really big on social learning, this idea of social constructivism, so how we construct our learning together in that. Then we had a fellow, Terry Anderson, who was also a doctoral student and a really good friend of mine, a doctoral student of Randy's at the time. He was the director of the Teaching and Learning Center. He had also done a lot of work with Indigenous communities. And his idea, if we're going to get this worked, it's got to be teaching, not teacher presence. We've got to create a community where over time, the responsibility is not only shared, but our learners take on more and more responsibility through the learning process, so that at the end of they see themselves as teachers, which is exactly what you're trying to do in your programs. So what I'd like us to do now is take that Venn diagram and put it into practice. And hopefully you can share some ideas in Q&A, but we can get some real tangible things. So my gosh, I think the world's always been complex, but it just seems as I get older, the complexity is overwhelming. And again, I'm working with teacher educators, and there's no magic formula, but we really have to figure out what are some of our key tasks, our key roles. And again, working in a community, who are the people who can help us? Because we're only one person. We're not built to go 24 hours, 7 a days. So who are we going to have in our community? Who is going to support us with our role as teacher educators? So there was a lot of work done in this area, and this is Terry Anderson's dissertation work. It was done, I know for some of you, it might have been done before you were born, but this is an area when I was doing a lot of research. It was in the 90s. The web was there, but we were doing a lot of work with online discussions, and we called it computer-mediated communication. And these are some of the folks that were doing a lot of research in the area. There was two Americans, Zane Burge and Bob Mason, and a fellow that you may have heard at work, just doing incredible work still today, is Morten Poulsen from Norway. He's set up the International Council for Open and Distance Education, not only a pioneer, but just really incredible in terms of really sharing openness. And they found, there seems to be three primary roles. There's sort of the planning role, or let's call it the design. So the design often happens before, but it's an ongoing process because we get to know our learners and they get to learn more each other as we go through a learning event. So the organization's dynamic. There was social, but it's more than social. It's a modeling, it's a facilitation. I'll talk about that. And again, let's not throw the baby out with the water. It's not being a guide on the side or a sage or a stage. All of us have pedagogical expertise, and a lot of us have subject matter or content expertise as well. So Terry took that. I took the work of Dennis, and we came up with this idea of teaching presence. And you can see how I've emphasized the ing. So again, what's so important when we're looking at teaching presence, when we're looking at design in the organization, it's the relevance. It's that first R. And again, we'll see in a minute. We're right on time here. It's not just happening at the beginning of the course, it's throughout the course. Again, often, the learners get excited. We do icebreaker activities at the beginning, but we can't sustain that sense of community, that sense of empowerment that we learn each other throughout the learning event. So we'll talk about that. The second one is this idea of relationships and how important it is for us to model the type of behavior. This would be in online discussions, in synchronous events, but modeling the type of behavior that we want to see from our learners. And then last but not least, we'll talk about the nudge factor, is gently pushing people out of the comfort zone, because as Piaget said, this is where the real learning takes. We create a bit of cognitive dissonance, and then there's the assimilation and the accommodation to come up with the new content, the new information, the new mental frameworks. Okay, so finally, let's get going here. Let's put the pedal to the metal, the practice. So again, I've been fortunate to work with all these folks. They say they're retired. They still work with me. I'm still active. They still are my mentors. And you'll see there's a link. It's an open access book, but this is lifted right from a book. And I'm sort of giving you the Reader's Digest, some of the highlights from my perspective. So again, community of inquiry framework. If we're going to create this rich experience, we're going to need to combine, again, not only people's brains, not only that there's a social aspect to learning, not only that everybody's going to be involved, but there's a new ring on the outside called emotional presence. Again, just, emotion really conditions. When we're upset, when we're mad, when we're stressed, we're anxious, we're often like a turtle. We'll go into a shell. There's not going to be a lot of turning place like that. We need to create safe environments where people feel willing to take risks. And, we talk about first attempt in learning, fail. It's an iterative process. Okay, here we go. So what we did, and I got to work with Deb Dell, an amazing woman, Marty Cleveland at Emmis, who's at our Open University Athabasca. And of course, Randy was always there, and he wasn't in the shadows. He always wants to be at the end, but he was really there. So what we did, we took sort of this idea of design, and we looked at, we're designing again for people to feel safe, but also safe to take risks with their learning. So we've got these two principles for the design. Then again, if we want this facilitation, we want to make sure that it happens throughout. Again, we're going to initially create that cohesion and community, but the dynamics, how it's going to change, how we need to attend to the needs of the community as we go through a learning event. Again, the sustaining, the idea that people love to ask questions, but we need to make them move forward with inquiry. And again, I'm teasing Randy a little bit, I'm teasing myself. For some reason, in a lot of cultures, we love the number of seven. And again, I think this is maybe the most important one, that we're ensuring the type of feedback that's taking place, the self-feedback, the peer feedback, the teacher feedback, expert external feedback really is aligned with the intended outcomes, that these are learning spaces, not social spaces. So let's begin. So again, the first principle really is around design and organization. And just going back to what we took is learners, they need to, my experience over life is they need to see themselves in the learning. If it's an abstract construct, this is just too far up the learning ladder for them to go, it's not going to make sense. So how are we at the outset of a course really going to find out, what are the learners? We talk about prior learning experience, especially when we're dealing with adults, or even I find young children. Young children have a lot of experience to bring. Let's find out what the experience, let's find out what questions they have related to the outcomes so that we can celebrate, we can empower them. They can see that, they've got opportunities to share for others, but that they can learn from others as well. So one of the things that I find is really easy to do, and especially when you're looking with large numbers, is to do some sort of pre-module, pre-course, pre-training session quiz before we start. And, these are the questions I use. You can use any you want, but this is always key for me because I'm always curious. Again, it's more than the learning outcomes because it often is related to life experience. What do you want to take away from this module, this course experience? What do you expect to happen, whether it's a virtual webinar or, if we have the blessing to have a physical presence? What do you expect to do outside of the classroom? How do you think you're going to be assessed? And the most important thing, what's going to be your professional learning network? I'm here, I'm going to be your teacher, but you're going to need to have other mentors, other people who can support you in this activity. So again, what's really important is if we do that, we share that at our first virtual session or our first online discussion. I put people in small groups. And again, we work through this and come up with some guidelines that are going to be specific to that module. And just quickly on that, this is really important because I often teach 3 sections of the same course. So I've got 3 groups of students, and it's fascinating. Again, the outcomes are going to be similar. I want to have similar outcomes, but the dynamics are very different because the people, the expertise, the experience they bring are different. So we have different guidelines for each one of those. We're going to do one more slide and then just take a breather. Again, as I mentioned, we capture that, but my experience is we have stories. And this is probably the most powerful way. If we look at just virtual any religious traditions, any cultural traditions, it's about the power of storytelling. And this is where I find a lot of the learning can take place. And we need to create safe areas for the students to tell their stories. And Siren, I've got just about 25 past. So I'm just going to pause for a minute and Siren, turn it over to you and John for a moment. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and just see if we've got some questions, some things that we should maybe address before we continue on with the webinar. So Siren, back to you for a moment there.
Thank you so much, Norman, for for introducing this concept. So as you say, at the beginning, it's a bit overwhelming, but you explained things step by step. And I'd like to ask you one question from Jenny about all of these resources when managing communities or in our teaching environments. How can I manage the resources which are flooding to use for my needs, as it takes a lot of time to choose?
So Siren, this is such an important question, Jenny. The first thing is we need to honor the tools that we're given. So for example, we're using Zoom today. I'm so fortunate. I'm at an organization where I use Google Meet, so I need to honor that because that's what we're doing with all the courses. We also need to honor what we call the learning management or the course management system. You may be using Moodle, I'm using something to Desire Learn. We start with that. But Siren, what's so exciting for me, and again, this is where we really empower the learners. Now, obviously, it's a little difficult if you've got 1,000 students because you don't want to have 1,000 applications. But right at the beginning of the course, I do a bit of a needs assessment. What are some of the applications you're using already? So, for example, some people may be using Telegram, some people may be using WhatsApp. Again, we need to work also, Siren, about in Canada, we talk about freedom of information and privacy. In the States, it's FERPA. Again, there's issues about the tools we use because we don't want to break any privacy violations. But Siren, if we're going to have teaching presence, we create the conditions. We start sort of like with the skeleton that has been institutionally mandated, or whoever, if you're working with a nonprofit, and then where appropriate, and we make sure we check with appropriate channels, we use the tools and the resources they have. Because again, this is really important. And I just want to, I could talk for the whole session about this. This gets together with readings as well. I have some very seminal readings that I want the learners to have in my course, but I really want to empower them to bring them in. So for example, I get my learners, I'll do the first online discussion, but then I'll coach them. We do a lot of peer-to-peer learning. So I actually get the learners to be the ones who are the facilitators of the discussion and actually select the readings with help from me because I want to make sure it's appropriate. But again, I want to empower them because this is a reading for me. So Siren, sorry to be so long-winded with the question, but I think what's important if we're going to create a true community, it's got to be a meeting of the minds. So we create the platform, but then they bring in the secret sauce, the ingredients. They put the flesh on the body. I hope that helps.
Yes, totally agree with you. So we need to understand our audience. So needs assessment, understanding their accessibility functions as well, right? So this is also
And that is a whole other thing I haven't covered is accessibility is huge. So we could even do another webinar on that. Again, this is really important, Siren, when we're doing the resources, that we make sure they're accessible for everybody. You know, we've got captions, we've got things like that. So this is really important as well. And it's other important as well when you're using the tools, because in certain countries, in certain areas, tools are blocked. Like I know, for
China.
example, in K to 12 schools, they can't use tools like Facebook or Instagram. So, okay,
Mhm.
next
Okay.
question. I'm so
So
sorry about that.
yes, so many things to consider. So we need to make sure that our learners have access because this is especially for teaching presence, especially also with the AI tools now. We need to
Oh,
consider some other things with data protection and all other things. So we need to be really very critical at the beginning. Maybe planning stage is also very important in that sense, right?
and
In that.
and and, and also it's wonderful, Siren, I'm sure you have at your organization. We have people now who that's their job is they're doing a lot of research about AI and accessibility. So I often have them, I get them to join my first online discussion, or I get them to join the first virtual meeting because Siren, I'm learning as well, but I'm not the expert. And again, there's legal implications about this as well. So it's usually our librarians. I usually bring librarians in about this because they know the copyright issues, they know that. So again, when we're building the teaching presence, it's not just us and our learners, it's who can we bring in as community experts as well.
Mhm. Because from also from my experience, when learners cannot uh, connect at the beginning, they lose connection, right? Those beginnings at the beginning stage, we also need to make sure they have access and they are connected.
And again, Siren, this is really important. I'm sure all of you are doing out this. We actually, at our institution, we've got a website that the learners go to because we have different types of online or virtual courses. We have some that do the virtual sessions, like using Zoom, but we have others that don't because in Canada, it's amazing. I mean, just I'm talking about 60 kilometers outside of a major city, we don't have good connectivity. So they need to do the course in a different mode.
Mhm. Thank you. Norman, one more question. Actually,
Yes.
we have really good questions, so it's hard to decide.
Okay, but then we'll go back because I've got a few more things we got to finish. Okay.
Ravi Narayan asks, do you consider an in-service training program a good community of inquiry? Why? Why not? Why? What can be done to create engaging communities in such programs?
So that's my dissertation. And Siren, after this, you can pass it out. You don't have to read my dissertation, but it was the first paper I published after my PhD was how to create in-service communities of inquiry. Because if we can do that, then people have the capacities to create communities of inquiry with their learners. So I'll follow up on that because that is my background. I was at a teaching and learning center when I was doing my dissertation. So I did my dissertation on creating a community of inquiry for in-service learning rather than in, a formal undergraduate or graduate course.
Thank you, Norman. Yes, we would love to share your paper. And Feng Min asks, what do you suggest if an instructor wants to create creative communities of inquiry? You might have the same experience that when students get together, they may not involve in the inquiry process as the instructor expects. Sometimes students don't want to work with others, while students don't want to share their ideas. So you also mentioned it's teaching presence, not teacher presence. Maybe you can mention this.
And I can. So let's go to the slides because that's the next slide is how to do exactly that. Okay. So let's go with that question and we're going to answer it by the slides. Thank you, Siren. I'm teasing because that sets us up brilliantly. So again, design as an organization is so important. And what I really need to emphasize with design and organization, it happens not just before the course, but it's throughout the course. We need to constantly check in because the community is dynamic and we've done a lot of research how it goes through different stages. The other thing that I find is really important, again, you can use it maybe or not. Some people call it portfolios. We call them learning plans, professional learning plans, is getting your learners to set goals right at the beginning. So I'm involved in teacher training. These are our 5 core areas: professional responsibilities, planning, facilitation, assessment, environment. So once each semester, we don't do it for every module course. We get them to set goals for that time period. What are the goals? But then, okay, what are the action plans? How are you going to achieve those goals? And then finally, what are the artifacts? How are you going to just demonstrate that you've met those? Okay. And again, this is a wonderful elder that I've worked with a number of years. His name's Leroy Littlebear, just an incredible individual. He's Canadian. He's from my province, but in the mid-70s, he went down to that fancy university, Harvard, and set up the director. He was the first director of Indigenous Studies at Harvard University. But what I love about him, and this gets to the community, is the power of storytelling is that every time we hear the story, we're at a different point in our life. So we learn something different from the story. So when you think about parables, anything from different religious cultures, we tell the stories over and over again, but they have a different meaning. So what I want to really emphasize is this doesn't just happen at the beginning of the course. This is something that goes through. So the question I always get, and I get with my students, is I don't want to work with anybody. I signed up. I want a self-paced module. I want to do it at my own time, my own pace. I it's just terrible. This idea that maybe people aren't irrelevant, but we talk about the Pareto principle, and the Pareto principle is when we do group work, often 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work. So how do we change this? So I'll be honest, this is the biggest issue with me. They're not children, they're adults. So Norman, be careful. I have students coming in my program that have to do a lot of on learning because they've come through a system that has empowered individual learning over collaboration. So this has to be experiential. Anything I tell them goes in one ear, out the other ear. So some of the things that we start to work with is the idea, and this is really difficult for my students, and we have to do it experiential, that learning is a circular process. And again, I'm going to go Americans because I know we've got a lot of Europeans, but in my world, when I grew up, it was an A to Z process. Learning was a very linear process. You began, and you had final exams, and then you moved on. You never went back. But I think we all know in life that it's maybe sometimes one step forward, two steps backwards. So again, it's a circular process, and I could go on and on about that. This is something, this is fascinating. This is work that was done in the mid 60s by a really good friend of my father's, and it still applies. It's Bruce Tuckman. So what I try to do, it's low stakes. There's not a lot of marks, low assessment, but right at the beginning of my course, no matter what the subject area, I take them through a low stakes activity where I put them into a group activity where I know there's going to be conflict, but I want them to, it's almost like self-reflection, document the learning that took place as you went through this. So the way that Bruce's framework goes is it's a 5-stage framework. So what I try to do is put the learners in groups of 5. Also, some of you, if you've got an instructional background, you may have heard something called the ADDIE model. It's sort of the analysis, the design, the development, the delivery, the evaluation, the evaluation model at the end. So getting them responsible for each stage. So, it's a very ill-defined problem. It's not black and white. It could be about a classroom management. Again, it's a case study that they're familiar with, that's happened. And, we go through the forming, but very quickly, there's some storming, there's some issues, and we spend a lot of time talking about group protocol. I'll be honest, I've got some slides in a minute about actually putting together some learning contracts about roles and responsibilities. But I spend quite a bit of time in the beginning of this. And again, we only have a webinar, but there is 2 chapters in the book that give concrete examples for helping students learn to work together. And again, it's experiential. They have to see the value, why they're going to gain. I mean, not only is it more efficient, your work's going to be better. And I'm sorry about this. My wife's a ecologist, but the strength of an ecosystem is its diversity. If we have groupthink, we're not going to have great work. We need to have different perspectives, and we need to learn how to value those. The other thing that I work on a lot, and again, it's fascinating, this is ripped right out of kindergarten, is getting them to learn together. And I use the word constructive rather than critical. I know critical's there, but I'm trying to show that it's a constructive process, so that when we work together, we're giving peer feedback. We're not assessing grades, but we're trying to improve the quality of each work. And I always start with a strength-based approach. So again, what are 2 specific positive things? It's got to be more than good work. Little kids, they don't want you to say good work. If it's a turtle, why do you like my turtle? I really like the color of green. I really like your eyes, but I wonder if the turtle has legs. I wonder if it has a this. So we spend a lot of work on that. This is an area that's really been powerful for me. And again, we'll share the slides, is this idea of structured reading groups. So some of you, who are a little older in the group may remember Edward de Bono. Thinking Hats is putting students in groups where they have specific roles, specific activities. And again, this really works well for me for online discussions. We've got a reading each week. The roles change. Someone's going to be the discussion leader. Someone's going to wear the dark hat. They'll be they'll look at it a critical. Someone's going to be the connector, trying to see how this connects with, everyday life, comics, whatever. Someone's going to be the reporter who's going to report back about what took place. So again, my experience with helping people understand the power of collaboration is experiential activities, getting them to document. And I'll be honest, it does not happen overnight. We have this throughout our program, and it takes some of our teacher candidates 3 years to finally get this. Okay, so again, we're moving on time. It's going to work well. But I think what's really important for us as the person in charge is to model professional practice. And again, I heard CPD, community professional development. I really do want to talk to that person, because in my dissertation, I took community of inquiry. There's also really great work by H.N. Wenger, community of practice. And there's a really neat thing, Milt Cox. So whoever will follow up, my mind's getting off topic about that. But again, I think it's so important is when we're doing in-service, when we're doing professional development, that we're modeling this to help people develop the confidence, but also experiential learning. My experience in life is that unless I do something before the students, for example, I've got to work with AI activities. I've got to work with videos. I've got to wrestle with it myself before I ask my students to take that on as an assignment. Okay. The next one, last but not least, is this sense of challenge. And it's exciting. If things are too easy, it's in one ear, one out the out. My experience is they don't take a lot from your learning experience. So we need to challenge them in a safe way. But when you think about the gamification of education, whatever, I've got two young men. I love them dearly, but for some reason, I think one of them is addicted to online gaming. But if the game's easy, they're not into it. And also, I think it's James G. There's a fellow at the University of Arizona that talks about gaming being the most powerful form of assessment because you're getting constant feedback in order to move to the next level. So just quickly, if possible, and this has been really exciting for me, I work with, again, just quickly, the way Canada's set up is that 80% of our population is within 500 kilometers of the American border. So we've got this vast area where people, it's not urban area, remote, rural and remote really for me is my skin in the game. That's where the majority of my research is done. And what we've done is sort of a mixed mode of learning. So working with Indigenous communities, finding out who on the ground really is the one who's accepted to be the community leader. This may be somebody who doesn't have any formal education or whatever, but they're the leader. They're doing the learning on the ground. Myself and my team, we beam in for sort of virtual webinars, but they've got a physical presence where they can convert what they're doing online with us into a culturally appropriate area in their area. And I could go on and on. This is so important because our experience, when we remove the cultural leaders, the leaders of communities, and we bring them down to the urban areas, very few of them return to those rural areas. And we've lost the capacity, the leadership capacity there. So just quickly, the way we do it is we try to have a pre-seminar or reading something. There's a little online discussion. And then we actually do sort of a place-based seminar, which is a hybrid. So they've got us coming in virtually, but they're physically there, so they're able to have a physical context. The way we can get away with that as well is where I live is the home of dirty oil. We have the dirtiest oil in the world. It's the tar sands. With it comes a lot of money. We also have somebody you've probably heard of who went to the same university I did, Queen's University, not in Belfast, Queen's University in Canada. He graduated 20 years after me. You know his name, Elon Musk. He came up with this idea of Starlink, and it's been wonderful. At least that's one of the few positive things he's done. We've got him. We've almost got his array of satellites to go north of the Arctic Circle now. So believe it or not, in these really remote communities in the middle of nowhere, I'm talking they're 10,000, no, not 10,000, but thousands of kilometers from anywhere. We now have high speed links so that we can do sort of this idea of high flex learning, having people face to face, but then beaming in other people. Okay, move it on, Norm. Then the other thing, again, I think it's really important to celebrate learning and also to see that it's a lifelong learning process. One of my sisters, I used to call it human resources. I guess they call it talent management. I know a lot of you've heard LinkedIn. I keep forgetting that LinkedIn is owned by Microsoft, which for some reasons is not a friend of mine. But again, getting people to go visible learning, I find this pushes their learning practice as well. So again, I talked about these learning plans. So for us, I'm helping people not only get a degree, but helping them become certified so that they can be K-12 teachers in my province. But once they're out there, in order for them to recertify, they have to have a professional learning plan. So every year, what they have to do is sit down with their principal, their school manager, set out what are the goals? What are you going to be working on professionally this year? And then how are you going to document it? How are you going to show to me and others you're doing it? So it's wonderful. They create this platform with me, or not with me, with my whole department, but they continue using it. So this idea of lifelong learning as they go out. And again, it's a wonderful tool for getting jobs, careers. The other thing is then they link this. This is part of their LinkedIn professional LinkedIn page. And it's fascinating for what I'm seeing now, and I'm happy about it because I don't want any to burn out, is a lot of people, again, I forget what it is, but we lose a third of our young people from the teaching profession within the first 5 years to get burned out. But what I'm trying to show them, there's other areas you can contribute. It doesn't have to be in a classroom. You can work with nonprofits, you can work with Indigenous groups, you can work with the museums. So it's really fascinating how they've been able to use this professional learning plan to pivot. They're still learning. So for example, one woman who was a real leader, an Indigenous student we had, she runs an organization called Spirit North, and it's about land-based learning. So she's not in a conventional K to 12 school. She's working and empowering young people to take on leadership positions, but all the learning is taking place in the land. It's not taking place sort of in our American concept of a school. Okay. And then just we're running out of time. I can't emphasize this enough. In real life, we all do sign contracts. And again, if we really want students to take responsibility and we want them to learn how to work effectively in groups, we get them to do contracts. And in the next slide, I've got tons of resources. It's called team-based collaborative online learning. All these ideas, and again, we're not being punitive, but what happens? The groups create a contract. Me as being sort of the manager, the leader of the course, the module, I have to sign off. But there's real world implications. Again, if one of the group member doesn't come through with their work or other, of course, there's all kinds of opportunities for us to learn how to mediate conflict. And I'm sort of the last level of conflict management is try to help students. Again, we're setting them up. Conflict is real. Conflict's going to be in the workplace, and let's try and avoid personal conflict. It's going to be maybe conflict of ideas, but helping them resolve that. Okay, we're coming to the end. And again, we'll make sure we share this. This used to be in the States. We've moved it to one of our larger universities. It's the University of British Columbia, but it is what a wealth of learning, just resources to help your students. Again, that's the biggest thing, but help them how to learn to successfully learn, collaborate in an online environment. Or in my area, it's more and more of a hybrid blended, because what happens in online, we want to make sure it applies face-to-face as well. So just wrapping it up here, there's a fella, Cass Sustein, who's written a really neat book about the nudge factor, but nudging students forward with the learning. So part of the community inquiry framework is getting people to move, they've got a question, they explore different sides, but getting them to integrate it, to test it out and to resolve real world problems. And last but not least, there's a social concept, but this is a learning space. And again, I know all the emotional things, but this is where we work with a team, because I get it. And I've seen it more and more. I've got students that have got anxiety issues. Honestly, even in City of Calgary, one of the wealthiest cities here, we have a homeless issue. We've got a food security issue. It's huge for our students. I get it. I'm not an expert in this, and this is where I need to work with people, bringing people in to make sure that my learners get the help they need. And I know we often think of Canada as a so-called first world country, but I'm seeing more and more of my students, and it's the sacrifices they have to make to try and be a teacher now is overwhelming, and it's happening right now in the city of Calgary. So how I can bring people in, how I can bring in community resources just to find a safe place for them to learn, to live, so that they can learn in my course. And this is in the urban area of Calgary. So we're going to open up. We're right on time for discussion. Just a last couple of things I just want to emphasize is this is nothing new. Some of you, I'm not sure if you're beaming in from down under, but if you've had any experience with the Maori culture, the Maori don't have a word to learn. They don't have a word to teach. It's called a cow. They've got a wonderful national center for teaching and learning for all the tertiary institutions. And again, it's the reciprocal nature. I teach to learn. I learn to teach. Last slide, and then we'll get it for questions. Some of you may be familiar with John Hattie's work, a Kiwi. All his work was done with the Maori people. He's based in Melbourne now, but I just love this quote. I think this really sums up a community for me, is that what we do, we want to see our learners as their own teachers. That's what we're involved with teacher education, and specifically with you, is helping empower people to empower others to learn the language of English. But what's so important for me and what keeps me young and in my mind, I think I'm always 19, is I really see learning in a different way because the world is changing. It's a dynamic world, and for some reason, it seems to change much more quickly. But I'm really understanding the context they're learning in it. And what worked for me when I was 19 is not working for them. So they have become my teachers as well. And with that, just a blatant plug. Mark, you said you put the link in. I just want anything I do now is I make sure it's open access. The PDF's free if you've got a printer. If you do want the book, there's just a very marginal cost just because there is a printing cost for Athabasca University, but everything, and I said it and more, is all in the book. So again, it was just a quick snapshot. The other thing then is, look at that. I'm going to stop sharing and it's over to Ciaran. I know we don't have a lot of time, Ciaran, but there may be some folks who have some questions, but I do want to emphasize, Ciaran, if it's not too much work for you and John, just because we won't be able to answer all the questions, if you could even just send me the transcript of the Q&A, and I promise I'll spend the time answering those and send them back to you so that you can send them out to everybody.
That would be great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Norman. So we have some questions okay, the first question is from Guzia. So Guzia says, I'd like to know your opinion. What's the best tip for creating a positive atmosphere of learning in a multilingual environment? From Kazakhstan, she's asking.
So, this is fascinating. And Ciaran, the more I know, I don't know. But I'm learning in Zoom, there's a multi-translation function. So I'm going to step out of my comfort zone. But I think pretty well everybody on this webinar is involved in helping people learn English. Is that correct, Ciaran?
Um, Mostly, yes, teachers of English who are working with teachers, who are helping teachers, mentoring teachers and
Okay.
teachers, or in pre-service, in service.
So the reason I'm being careful, Ciaran, is again, in Canada, I wish we are a multilingual country, but we have two official languages, French and English, but for various reasons. It's obvious reason. The predominant language is in English. So that is often what drives. And as we know, language is our culture. There's a lot of things that can't be translated at all from one language over to another. So it's really neat. What we've tried to do is using these webinars is doing a lot of simultaneous translation. And again, it's not perfect because, as I just said, it doesn't come over. But I think this is the most important thing. And again, this is what we're going through, Ciaran, in Canada, is our own truth and reconciliation process. We're reconciliating just our relationship to the land and our relationship to the Indigenous people. A lot of people know about our history in Canada, about residential schools, about marginalizing our Indigenous groups. So we need to do this in an authentic way to raise up the voices that people have traditionally been marginalized in our country. And it really starts with language. So sorry to go on and on and on, but we have to do it in a way that people are able to express themselves in their language. And I know it's not a perfect translation, but it starts that, Ciaran, I think this is really important. I know I'm being long-winded again, but it starts with people being able to speak their language and then somehow translate it. And again, Ciaran, this is where I think AI is going to be a game changer. AI does this instantaneously. And I think it really helps because I don't want to put translators out of business, but this is where technology can help us. Because if we're going to create a safe environment and we're bringing people in who have different languages, again, it's not just the languages, it's their representation in society, that we create a playing field where everybody has a voice.
Oh, that's a very interesting point of view. You are right. So it will revolutionize in that way. So it
I,
will
I,
community.
I'm excited. I just, and my wife is a very proud French Canadian, and that's my children's first language is French, not English. So she does a lot of national work in Canada and making sure that both languages represented, and watching what's happening now with Zoom is just, it's really making me feel like we're going in a positive way.
Thank you so
More,
much. Yes. Another question. So we are moving on. Joad is asking, okay, let me find the question. Yes. What challenges do teacher educators encounter when implementing the Community of Inquiry framework, and how do they address these challenges?
Well, and again, I think the biz, and honestly, don't want to be slight, but that's what the book's all about, because I think the biggest challenge is working in a really effective community, because just when we start as well, I get people, and I saw somebody bring it in, I'll make sure I do. We actually have a bit of a self-assessment tool for students as well, because I think it's important to recognize that they often come with a lot of negative experiences about group work. So let's not throw that under. Why was it experience negative? And what can we learn from it? So again, let's not just throw that out and ignore and say everything's going to be beautiful, but why was it negative? And how can we learn for that so that this one will be positive in the future? The other thing, Siren, I really got to emphasize over and over and over and over and over is communities are dynamic. Again, my experience, especially online, is the first session, it's wonderful. We do lots of icebreakers. People go, oh, isn't this nice? This is great. But where the rubber really hits the road in the conflict is when we're actually doing work together. And again, I really want to emphasize, I always have group work set up that it's feedback. We're never giving anybody a number or a letter, a grade. It's always feedback. I really emphasize that it's almost like a publication process. Again, Siren, I just can't, I'm so excited to see what you're going to publish from your dissertation. But Siren, whether you like it or not, you're going to have to go through your peers. There's going to be a peer editing process. So the more I can build in that the reason we're giving feedback from each other is to improve the quality of the work. The other thing, Siren, and I know AI may take a bit of that, it really is helpful for me, because if we do a lot of this peer work, by the time the work comes in to me for summative assessment, I can focus on the conceptual understanding. I'm not worried about the reference formatting. I'm not concerned about grammar, anything in that. And honestly, I know this is going to be controversial, but this is a little exciting for me for AI as well, Siren, because again, every day, I know it's not a big number for you, but every day in our public system, we have 70 new students. None of those students, English is their first language. What we've got is a local group it's called Progressive AI. I'll send you theirs. They've worked with our school board. We've got these ELL benchmarks. Now what happens, a child can speak into a mobile phone or whatever. It'll instantly diagnose what level of proficiency they have and then provide them with the auditorial tools. It's almost like Duolingo on steroids, just to empower them. And it's really exciting, Siren, because our experience is the children are the ambassadors for our new Canadian families. Children learn the English language so quickly is they can then empower the family in terms of the different services that may be required, the medical services or whatever. So Siren, I know we're going to run out of time in 2 seconds, but I really want to hang out with your community, because language is it's what's empowering, and especially when you're in a new land, a new country where for various reasons, English is our dominant language here. But we have right now, and you cannot put up walls. People are coming. I was on a plane just 2 days ago from Frankfurt. It was fascinating. 75% of the people on those planes were people, and the stories they were telling me, I don't know how they're getting out of Gaza. I mean, we've had people coming out of Ukraine and Syria now for a few years, but it's really exciting because they're really contributing in such an exciting way to our country, but it needs to be done. And I see the producer, Siren, we're going to get cut off. Sorry about it, but I will follow up. I will follow up.
Oh, sorry, I missed the most exciting part. So thank you so much, Norman. So you were talking about the communication, the language. So as ELTT as teacher educators in this English language teaching area. All of these ideas, I think, are really important, and we need to, as one of our colleagues mentioned, we need to watch the recording again. So James mentioned, thanks for the intellectually nourishing webinar. So Just a second. Yes, I will be rewatching the video over and over again in order to digest all the great ideas. So yes, we do really need to do this. You have shared so many important tips and ideas.
But let's keep the dialogue going. Video's great, but honestly, if you compile any questions, because Siren, maybe you could
Mhm.
be the mediator for me, because my experience is you have one of these, but it's probably you go, gosh, I wish that I asked that question, or you go
Mhm.
back to work. Those are the ones that are more important to me, and I'd love to send. So again, the video's great. I'll be honest, I have trouble watching myself because Siren, where did the hair go? I remember, I thought, come on, I don't look like I'm 19. Okay, we need to shut up. I'll be quiet.
No,
Okay.
no. Thank you so much for offering. So we would really like to ask those other questions that we haven't had a chance to ask. And yes, find out more about your perspective. So about you have mentioned so many important points like the challenging environment, the peer reviewing, feedback especially. We couldn't really discuss some of the other things you have mentioned. So thank you so much once again, and thank you our participants. So it's been really very informative, and we need to watch the recording again, and I would like to encourage our colleagues to download Norman's book. You can find the link in the chat. So it's including lots of useful tips as well about community of inquiry and shared metacognition. Very practical. And also, I'd like to share some other reminders before we finish the session. So we hope you found the session useful, and please also remember to join our newsletter for teacher educators to have updates about our upcoming events. And you can also join our next month's webinar will be Teacher Educator Webinar Series Review. So we will be reviewing all of the webinars that we have conducted this year. And we will have a panel of speakers on 20th of March on Wednesday to reflect on the main insights from our latest Teacher Educator webinar series. And we will also look at the future theme. So it will be like the stars together in one session. So please join us in the forthcoming sessions. And thank you so much once again, Norman, for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you, our colleagues, for joining and for your questions. Hope to see you in our future session.